Madam Speaker, as I have already stated previously in this House, the draft Freedom of Information Bill submitted by the Attorney General's Office is being examined at the level of my office. In my statements, I also highlighted the complexity of this exercise, given the numerous and far-reaching implications of this piece of legislation, ranging from constitutional to public interest issues, impact on the working procedures of the public service, preservation of sensitive commercial information, cost implications, amongst others. I also mentioned the need to draw inspirations from the best practices in other jurisdictions so as to avoid any pitfalls or negative unintended consequences. But at the end of the day, the law has to be homegrown and adapted to our local context, taking into account our local realities, including the required resources and its impact on public service delivery. Hence, the need to proceed with great care and caution. Madam Speaker, this exercise of internal examinations of the bill is ongoing, and once completed, all stakeholders will most certainly be consulted prior to its introduction into the National Assembly.
Yes, Madam Speaker, we agree on the complexity and far-reaching implications of the bill, but at the same time, the House will recall that answering to a PQ in 2016, the then Honourable Prime Minister informed the House that the draft bill, a first working draft bill, has been circulated in-house. So it's been almost 3 years now that a first draft bill has been circulated. Therefore, can I ask the Honourable Prime Minister, why is it taking that long, 3 years, and also what is the time frame for finally to be circulated publicly?
Well, Madam Speaker, let me first of all express my satisfaction that we agree that it is a very complex piece of legislation. Very complex, so much so that in 2000, replying to a question from the opposition, because we were in government, MSM at that time, the then acting Prime Minister said, and I quote, "I can assure the House, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that we mean business. Legislation to provide the necessary framework for better access to information will be introduced at the opportune time, and in that context, I have been informed that a bill had already been prepared and had been submitted to the former government, but there had been no action taken on that piece of information." I don't want to quote other parts of the answer. That was on the 31st of October 2000. Now, that previous government in which I was a member did not come up eventually with a Freedom of Information bill. Because, as we say, it's rightly so, it is a very complex issue. It has to be looked at very carefully, and especially in the light of what has happened in other countries. And I'm talking about countries like India, UK, and others, where even after having passed such a legislation, then we have seen the consequences of the implications of that legislation, and even there have been comments made by prime ministers with regard to that legislation. So we must be very careful. It will take time, it takes, but let us be very cautious about this.
Yes, Madam Speaker, this issue has been debated in the House for more than 20 years, and I've even checked it in Hansard. And today there is an urgency. The urgency is because there are state-owned enterprises where information are not available, which is funded by public funds. So therefore, can I ask the Honourable Prime Minister if he will agree with me that there is need there is an utter need to come quickly with such legislation in the name of transparency and accountability.
Well, Madam Speaker, I think for 20 years it has been urgent to bring this kind of legislation. And for 20 years there have been so many governments. I'm happy that we all have been in government, you know. I don't want to take the time of the House to mention, for example, what also the former Prime Minister, Dr. Navin Ramgoolam, what he stated in this very House. In fact, what happened, it was in the Labour Party's program at one time, it was removed because the Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister, stated to this very House that it is so complex that we have preferred to remove it from the government program. Just to show how difficult and how complex this piece of legislation is.
Honourable Ganoo.
Madam Speaker, since the answer which the Honourable Prime Minister has given to the PQ resembles a lot the answers he has given in the past question asked on this subject, may I therefore ask the Honourable Prime Minister, in view of the fact that we are at the end of the mandate, a few months are left, can he therefore, in all honesty, give a pledge and a commitment to the nation that before the end of the mandate of this government, the Freedom of Information Act will be introduced in this House? Because you talk of India, even a country like Trinidad and Tobago has a freedom of information which is working properly in this country.
Let me say, Madam Speaker, that in everything that I do, I am as honest as I can be, first of all. And secondly, the Honourable Member, he himself, he has been in member of past governments, has been dealing with this issue himself also. And let me quote, I didn't want to mention all these, but it's good that I quote what the World Bank report has highlighted with regard to implementation of freedom of information. I'm talking about World Bank report. I'm not talking about our opinion or anybody else. World Bank report says the unintended negative consequences, such as, you're talking about India, I mentioned about India. In India, the legislation had led to greater public mistrust of government and has damaged democracy. The American democracy has become dysfunctional, partly because of excess in transparency. Too much openness has undermined the effectiveness and legitimacy of government. And in UK, Madam Speaker, UK, which is normally a model when you talk about transparency and so on. UK former Prime Minister Tony Blair, who introduces the Freedom of Information Act in year 2000, has himself admitted that he regrets the act. He described the act as dangerous and utterly undermining of sensible government. And for his part, the former Prime Minister David Cameron, he stated, and I quote, "We spend, or the system seems to spend, an age dealing with freedom of information requests, which are all about processes, and actually what the public or the country want to know is how much money you are spending, is that money being spent well, and what are the results, and of good." I think this summarizes the very difficulty that we have, the complexity of the matter. And as I say, because once we come up with legislation, we have to be very, very cautious about what are the exact consequences of that kind of legislation.